prosegue il ciclo organizzato da Castelvecchi Editore insieme a IPER Festival delle Periferie, cominciato con Leonardo Boff e poi è proseguito insomma con eminenti ospiti di caratura internazionale e nazionale, dato che ieri abbiamo avuto Umberto Curi e anche Chiara Bottici, che sta insomma fra i due mondi. E oggi è veramente un piacere accogliere qui con noi Jack Bratic, che insegna giornalismo e media studies alla Rutgers University e si è occupato molto di cultura popolare, teorie cospirazioniste, movimenti sociali, e la nostra casa editrice ha appena pubblicato la prima traduzione in italiano del suo libro Microfascismo, genere, guerra, morte, dove Bratic fa un lavoro veramente impressionante di analisi appunto di microfascismo e di conseguenza anche della possibilità di combattere, diciamo, le forme, le manifestazioni fasciste nella vita ordinaria, quotidiana delle nostre società, e per cui insomma lo accogliamo qui a IPER Festival con grande entusiasmo, perché finalmente abbiamo anche una voce che guarda al nostro tempo. Benvenuto e ti lascio la parola.
I'm going to speak English today because I don't know Italian very well, but I believe there are translation capabilities here. So I want to say first, thanks Christina, and thanks to Castelvecchi for this timely and important translation. I'm honored to have it translated into Italian. So thank you very much. Thanks to the organizers of the IPER Festival, Linda, who's been an excellent contact and support throughout, and for having me here to talk about this. So yes, today's talk is going to be where the imagination leaves us. I'll talk about that later. Fascist Fantasmagoria and reimagining the end of the world. So as you see, this is the cover of the book. So some of the things I talk about today have come out of the book, but they've been expanded now to new things. So I wanted to write something or speak today on something that's related to the theme of this festival, the imagination. And so I start with the question, what kind of imagination is possible during an era of collapse, during a time of collapse? And I often open, as many scholars and writers do in the last 10 years, they open with a quote from Gramsci. I probably should have used the Italian in this one since I'm here, but when he talks about a crisis, and he says, the old is dying and the new cannot yet be born. In this interregnum, morbid phenomena of the most varied kind come to pass, and he's talking about the transition time. Part two will be more about the contemporary imagination, and I will be focused on the United States and a series of examples. So those will mostly be case studies. The first one will be more conceptual, the second one will be case studies, and third will be a part on, that's more speculation, that is about the study or the thinking about collapse. Ecological collapse mostly, but also economic, social, political collapse that people often say they feel or they see, but the question is, how do we really imagine during those moments? Okay, so I hope I can get through a lot of this. There are a lot of slides. I'm hoping most of them will be also visually interesting because they will have images, but some of them, like the beginning, will have more words. So again, I apologize for the excess amount of words on slides. So in the classic studies of interwar European fascism, scholars like Federico Finkelstein has talked about the role of myth and imagination. And he says that in fascism, the fabled nature of the myth is converted to the order of the real. In other words, this idea of imagination, this idea of the image, or is not just a fantasy, it's not just a representation outside, right? It's not just somewhere a separate sphere, but it's always designed to be translated into reality, to reshape, to remold reality itself. It authorizes an implementation in material life. And the goal is to transform subjects, towards political action. I'm summarizing like a number of scholars here. I have to do this quickly, I'm sorry, but just this idea again of conversion of the imagination into the real has been the design of the project. Okay, scholar Jeffrey Schnapp, has written a number of things on a very particular production of the myth becoming reality, or this other world. He calls it an other world, and that is the Mostra della rivoluzione fascista, the exhibition of the fascist revolution in 1932, and he analyzes this entire exhibition. It's a very large and important exhibition that went on for years. Many of you already know this. I'm just speaking to people who know things. But I wanted to highlight how he talked about this as a production of an other world, where people would walk in and they would be immersed. Like we talk today about immersive media, immersive environments, right? Things that surround us. But he's talking about this back then, and specifically talks about the last room, a room of the martyrs, in which he calls it a rally of the living dead, taking place in some kind of afterlife, right? So it's a very religious, spiritual, it's not just elsewhere though, it's there, you're surrounded by it. So here are images of that last room. So this other world, he says, is a kind of derealization, right? To empty reality out and then fill it with myth, to reshape it. So a derealization. We'll come back to that concept later. But this was not just the exhibition, it was throughout culture. So this is also from scholars who study fascism primarily as a cultural phenomenon before it becomes a governmental or a state organized effort. It also takes place in everyday life at the level of culture. That's part of the microfascism that I talk about in the book, the importance of everyday life. Okay. A number of other scholars, I just want to highlight this theme again about the reshaping of reality through the image, through the imagination, through media, specifically in Nazi Germany, through cinema, and writers like Susan Sontag, Stassa Edwards, right, speak of this, that the transformation of reality is what matters. That the rallies are set up like a stage also for the camera, for the screen, that the masses then see themselves in, right? So the masses assemble, then eventually the masses assemble to watch the screen of themselves on it, and they become what is also on the screen. So the image, let me just try this, oops, it's hard to get the laser. The image is no longer simply the record of reality. Reality has been constructed to serve the image. This begins to get us to the second main concept, the other world, but now the Fantasmagoria. The Fantasmagoria was a 19th century space of horror and entertainment. It was a horror theater that projected frightening images, right? So we are standing in the legacy of the Fantasmagoria, right? So the frightening images, magic lanterns, people in the audience would be scared, they'd be horrified. And the word comes from phantasma, right? Image, phantom, apparition, unreality, specter, spirit, ghost, and agora, assembly. So Phantasmagoria, the assembly of the spirits, the assembly of the ghosts, of the spectrum. Okay. So that's happening in the 19th century, and what I want to highlight here is the kind of the ghosts and the skulls, but also the production of this. The production of this imagination is a projection. It is what Susan Buck Morris says, the perfection of the illusion that the work of art is reality and sui generis, right? That it self-generates. So you hide the camera, the magic lantern, and then the screen, or above the screen, the phantoms fly, right? Okay. But it's the production that matters. And so we begin to think about what is the production today. And one of the last things I'll talk about in this section, this part, Theodor Adorno, the famous cultural and social philosopher and theorist, critical theorist, examined Wagner and Wagner's operas as Phantasmagoria for Nazi Germany, and but specifically, I won't read all of this, but specifically around the themes of collective death and the ways that the ways that the audience is transformed through the flooding of the senses, but also is imagining a kind of passion for death. And it's something that scholars have noted that Hitler and Nazis, the Totenkult, the kind of cult of the dead, results in a kind of national suicide. Okay, so these are just themes from the past. So I think this part ends with this. So this morbid symptom that Gramsci talked about at that time, I used the word death style to begin speaking of what that might look like in terms of culture. We know a word like lifestyle, what a lifestyle is. My lifestyle is this. I eat this, I drink that, my lifestyle. I go here. But what would it mean to think about a death style? The ways that individuals or societies give to themselves a form of mortality and a form of death. I draw off of Klaus de Wieland's book, Male Fantasies, which is a study of the Freikorps in the 1920s, and the way they had a passion for a certain kind of death, but it was very specifically tied to masculinity. I'll just mention it now as a kind of cultural theory of fascism, pre-fascism. But his phrase is that this other world is a producer of life-destroying reality, right? So it's an interesting concept. It's not just destroying reality. It's a life-destroying reality. Reality still exists, but now it has been emptied of life. Devivification, he says. Okay, so let's, before I get into the contemporary part, I want to say a little bit about the US. And my examples are going to be, from here on, for the rest, are going to be US examples, because that's what I'm really studying. But this is pre-20th century, or around the turn of the 20th century in the US, that I want to highlight, partially because some scholars say that that the Nazis were enamored with this part of the United States, of the Southern Confederacy, right? The Civil War in the U.S., in which the Southern states tried to secede and tried to establish their own nation, and they lost. They failed, right? However, what's more important than the war is the post-war, when we have a significant rise in a culture of the South, in which they erected statues and monuments to the defeated, right? To the martyrs, to the, in some ways, to the ghosts of that war. And anthropologists like Michael Tausig talk about the importance of statues and the importance of the faith in marble, he calls it, right? The ways that a kind of civil religion emerges through the monument and through these statues. Okay, so this is what's happening. It is called in the U.S. the lost cause, right? This is the main phrase for this, and the lost cause discourse, right? The lost cause phenomenon really takes place 20 years after the Civil War, also 30, 40, so in the early 20th century is where a lot of this begins to happen. And what's interesting is it starts with a group of women. They're called the United Daughters of the Confederacy, right? So they are the daughters of the soldiers who died, or the kind of Southern way of life that happened. But this is a cult of the dead. The initial ceremony that starts this lost cause by these women is they dig up a grave and they move a body from one site to another, right? So it's already a kind of necromancy, right? A kind of ritual of the dead and a ceremony for the dead, and literally of the corpse. And then they begin erecting, you know, imitations of the corpses in the statues. Okay, but this is not just memory. This is not just a way of, you know, lamenting the past. This is a call to action. So these are images. The main phrase of the Lost Cause is "the South will rise again." Right? Very much a kind of resurrection mentality. You know, and very often you'll just see some version of the death's head, some, you know, way that the skull or the skeleton comes back. Right? So it's very much a kind of, we will raise the dead and they will fight. So it's not just we raise the dead and honor them in statues. It's an inspiration. It's a call to action. As one scholar said, you can rally people to a last defense. You can mobilize people if they feel like this is the end, right? And they will sacrifice themselves. So it's a call to future action. It's hard to see, but this phrase here is also important. It says, fallen but not dead, right? And it shows a tree. So it's fallen, but it's not dead. So one day it will rise again, yeah. So this is still with us in the US, but I just wanted to point out, this is, you know, over 150 years now of this happening. Just as a side note, this is not exactly related, but I live in Philadelphia. I live in South Philadelphia, which is the home historically to a lot of Italian immigrants from the early 20th century, from the mid 20th century. They are very conservative and right-wing Italians there in Philadelphia. So this is not from the Civil War. This is a statue of Columbus. Christopher Columbus, which, as you know, is such a source of pride for Italian Americans. But here in summer of 2020, like 4 years ago, when we were also having the George Floyd uprisings in the US and statues were coming down, the local Italian men, older men, showed up to defend the statue of Columbus. And if you can't see, well, obviously there's a bat here, but this one has a rifle. Yeah, and this one does too. So these are just local guys with their rifles defending the statue. This is probably a 7-minute walk from my house. It's Marconi Plaza. So there's another Italian also, Marconi, but they don't care about Marconi, right? They care about Columbus. Okay, just wanted to give a little local clip. Okay, so the part 2 then. Setting up the more contemporary parts of the U.S. and what I consider, we can talk about why I consider the U.S. and a kind of an emerging fascist culture and society, but I just want to go through these examples. So this is older, the one on your right. So this is from the U.S. Nazi Party. I don't remember when, sometime in the 1930s in the US, Madison Square Garden, which is in New York City. They're one of the biggest venues of big concerts and sports are played there. This is the American Nazi Party. But I'm showing that to show the difference between, again, the kind of classic version, the mass spectator, right? Assembled, the masses, the pageantry, the rallies, and now something more, which is the networked performer. The online communicating, influencing each other, contagious, and in the background you see here images of the January 6th insurrection uprising in the US, January 6th, 2021, of the US Capitol. So we've moved from this to this, and I want to talk about how that is related to the changes in media forms, in the technical conditions of the contemporary society. Okay, so I'm going to use a number of these examples. Start with Trump, but it's not primarily Trump, it's happening on the ground. But I need to talk about Trump. if we think about what it means to make and fake reality as a kind of mythical and imagination project, Trump has been involved, at least in the, with the two main genres, cultural genres of that in the US at least, also around the world I would say, at least one of them. Reality TV, as we know, right? The Apprentice. So he's been involved in reality TV, which itself seeks to shape reality, but even more so, entertainment wrestling. He, not as well known, but he had a moment in the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, which we know again is both staged, but it sort of performs the real, as at the same time it's faked. This is probably my longest quote. I think it's so good, I wanted to just, so I'll read this one, because it ties these things together, death and reality. The advantage of Trump and his movement is that they do not care about reality or the truth. They are a death cult. They are not afraid to die. They are excited and motivated by the possibility of remaking reality itself because they are in a revolutionary mode. This is Alexander Himon. He's a novelist, and this is from an interview that he did. So again, tying this idea of the kind of necrotic, the necromancy with the shaping of reality. More recently, to think about some of the things, the phrases that Trump uses. This one was from a month ago, the one on your left here. Our cities are choking to death. Our states are dying. And frankly, our country is dying, right? This constant invoking of the death of the nation. And it goes back to, this is during his campaign, this was just a few weeks ago. This is from 2015, 2016, right before he got elected on the campaign trail. He says, the American dream is dead, but if I get elected president, I will bring it back. Right? Bigger and better than ever. I will resurrect it. Right? Again, this idea of the resurrection of something is dead, but now he has the power to bring it back to life, much like the South, much like the statues, the mobilizing people around the resurrection. This was just a couple days ago, so this has taken a kind of new turn. He often speaks about the country dying, but in this case, he's talking about one of his superfans in the audience, and he said basically, you'll commit suicide before voting for Biden, right? It's suicide, not Biden. And so that's a very, how do I say this, direct phrase. In the US, in English, we might say something like, I would rather die than have this happen, than eat this, very casually, I would rather die. But to say, I would rather commit suicide, or to tell someone, you would rather commit suicide than this, that's quite unusual. So it's a very more morbid kind of symptom than what is casually often said. But Trump, again, belongs to a tradition in the US of right-wing speech, far-right speech that uses death as its theme, right? Patrick Buchanan, probably one of the better known of the right-wing kind of talking heads, pundits from the last 25 years, especially around the turn of the 21st century, wrote two books, right? Death of the West, and then Suicide of a Superpower. One of John Michael Chambers wrote Trump and the Resurrection of America. Dinesh D'Souza, also very, very popular right-wing intellectual, wrote Death of a Nation, Can We Save America a Second Time? And you can see here already the other part of the necromancy I'm going to talk about, an image, right? To fuse Trump with the ghosts of the past. In this case, Abraham Lincoln, in this case, overseeing another civil war, right? Which is the kind of fantasy, in some ways, that the right wing has about also another civil war. They just passed, the Supreme Court just lifted the ban on I forget the name of the block, but it's a part you put into your rifle that allows you to keep shooting very fast. It was taken away a few years ago after a mass killing in Las Vegas. But the Supreme Court just 2 days ago or something lifted the ban so people can, once again, this is not from him, this is talking about his fans who depict him in paintings and in memes. One of the most well-known is a guy named John McNaughton, who makes a living off of these Trump paintings and prints and sells them mostly online. Much of the time he puts Trump in these kind of famous scenes from the past, or with figures from the past. So again, a kind of other world, as you could say. And he lives in an other world. Here they're just joking with different Republican presidents, but he's among the ghosts, right? He lives in this phantasmagoria, right? In terms of he's not dead, but the others, most of the others are, that he's depicted in this, again, imagination. So what does it mean to think about him in that way? Or here are some other more like internet-based memes with him, and in various crusades and local empires and such. So they imagine him as a conqueror, as a crusader, as an emperor, right? So this is a related note. I don't know, did this make the news here about how, this is a few months ago, how often men dream and fantasize, not dream, but fantasize about the Roman Empire? Did this, yes, right, okay. So in September, it was a meme in the internet, like a woman asked her husband or her partner, how often do you think about the Roman Empire? And he said, every day. This was in the US, right? And so this became a meme. People on TikTok asking their husbands, their boyfriends, how often do you think? And it turns out, men think about the Roman Empire a lot around the world. And so these are news stories about, these questions, like why are men obsessed with the Roman Empire? And they don't imagine it from the perspective, right, of the plebs, right, or the women. Of course, they imagine it at its peak as their emperors or leaders getting fed, right? So that is a fantasy and an other world and an imagination, I think, that matters, especially in the U.S. because of something like this, which is coming out. Which has been coming out for the last few months, this idea that this is, again, the right-wing intellectuals in the US. These are the ones who belong to institutes and Claremont Institute, and they write magazine articles and journal articles, coming up with this, what they call the Red Caesar plan, right? So obviously Caesar, and that someone needs to come into the US and just clear the mess, clear the chaos, clear the divisions, clear the ineptitude. So they imagine Trump as a kind of Caesar figure, right? So I don't know what to make of that, except that, it's somewhat daunting or to think about everyday men imagining this and then the right wing organizing it in terms of this kind of figure. Okay. Drew on some aesthetics and some ideas around futurism, the past, the ruins, necromancy, but I'm just going to move through them because I want to be attentive to time and how much time we have. Okay, yes, we should move on. But once we make Fashwave or make other memes, one of the things that many meme makers do is believe that it's something called meme magic, which is, again, the deliberate kind of production of reality through memes, right? That memes are not just these entertaining bits and digital objects, but that they have a kind of mythic purpose in the same ways that I talked about Finkelstein, the 20th century fascist notion of the imagination, to reshape reality. They, as humorous as something, and silly as something like this is, right? sorry, I mean, I can't go into, Keck was one of these memes, these frog memes from the 2016 campaign. Trump supporters would then create Keckistan. They made these flags. But what I want to highlight is that Richard Spencer, who was one of the intellectual founders and leaders of the alt-right in the mid-2010s, said that they were memeing themselves into reality, that the alt-right, that group, that movement, was primarily using memes to shape reality. And they also believed, this is an author who studied 4chan, which is the online site that for a long time has been producing memes, which is a kind of meme otherworld. He says how they accidentally memed Donald Trump into office. So many people believe, these young meme makers believe that they really are the ones who brought Trump into office. Young people did. But I can't go too far into 4chan. But I will mention two things that you might know about how 4chan left the digital world and went into reality to shape it. Two projects that came out of it. One is Anonymous, the group Anonymous in 2008, you might know about them. And then in 2014, Gamergate, which was a coordinated effort to harass women in the gaming world, in the gaming review world. It's known as Gamergate. So two instances where it started in 4chan, through memes, through humor, and then it went offline to action. If you know about QAnon, if any of you have read about QAnon in the US, you'll see that a number of scholars and just cultural analysts have thought about QAnon, this collective movement that is conspiracy-based. I can't explain it too much because of time, I'm sorry, but that it is kind of like a game, but an augmented reality game. If you don't know what an augmented reality game is, they've been around for at least 20-something years. When maybe a new movie wants to promote itself, so it starts a game in the actual world. You might look for clues on posters or somewhere, right? So it tries to bring the world of the image into the material world, and so it's a reality game also, right? So and some people have talked about how QAnon works like this, and maybe was even designed to be one, with political action as its goal. Okay, but now I want to get to the sort of some of the culmination of this before I get into collapsology. And so I should say, tell people that, especially those in the audience, but also those watching, that I will be talking about mass shooters. I guess you already have it up here, but I'll be talking about mass shooters. I won't show anything graphic, but I always like to tell people that, I will be talking about a couple mass shooters around this idea of moving from the internet, making reality out of the imagination, but a new kind, the meme-based, game-based imagination. Brenton Tarrant is the one who killed almost 50 people at mosques in New Zealand in 2019. His murder has been called mass murder of and for the internet, because he was so embedded in online culture that he turned his massacre into something like a game, not just with the live stream, but the live stream here, he used the game first-person shooter perspective with his camera, so it replicates the look of a game. He talked about it in terms of points while he was doing the shooting. There are a number of other things, but it was clear that he wanted to become a meme. So the shooter has become, I talk about this more in the book, so if you want to explore this more, you can read in the book. But the shooter, mass shooter in the US has become more like a troll, more like an influencer. So all the things drawn from the internet kind into real life. I guess I need to explain. So So shitposting is the practice of what one thing that some might say trolls do, which is to just produce content to push people's boundaries, right? It could be a chaotic, nonsensical content. That's called shitposting, right? Tarrant, the shooter, said, it's time to stop shitposting, and it's time to do what he called real-life effort posting, right? So stop doing this online and do it in real life, do it in the real world, but not just, it's to do the same kind of chaos and to turn the world into your space of chaos and meaning. So that even his manifesto, right? Many of these shooters have manifestos, but that it was not that serious. It was obviously deadly, it was lethal, but that it used jokes, it used memes, it was incoherent. So the manifesto is not a clear statement of one's beliefs, but is itself shitposting. Okay, I think I'm going to jump over this, but again, the importance of memes, I'll just say the meme importance. But the other part of this is that, again, the newer kind of phantasmagoria is done with an online culture that turns these shooters and other killers into saints and martyrs, heroes, warriors, right? So there's a whole range of these kinds of images online for these shooters. Okay, I want to start ending this part. Okay, yeah, losing track of time. Robert Crimo, in 2021, about 3 years ago in the summer, he's the one who was in Chicago at a parade. He killed like 6, I can't remember the numbers, but under 10, but then wounded like 40 people, injured them. So he left a significant online trace of himself. But again, what was a new development in this was what people called the post-manifesto shooter. He didn't really leave a manifesto, and this was puzzling to many people. Like, why wouldn't he? He had no clear targets. He had no clear object of hatred. He was online a lot and posted a lot about suicide. But it was more, again, about this kind of trollish edginess, a kind of, again, incoherent, confusing. So I'm going to show some images. This is from some of his videos. He was involved in what gets called gore posting, which are these online sites that show the aftermath of violence and death. And they try to post the most horrific images to each other so the community can witness and then almost be numb to the effects of the graphic nature of the violence. So they witness death. He actually had this animated video of what he was going to do, so he went to the trouble of conveying this, so he already had that. He was also a rapper, and he went by the name of Awake. Was his name? Awake, the rapper. He called himself a sleepwalker. And this line from one of his rap songs, "Living the dream, nothing's real. I just want to scream, fuck this world." Right, so he wants to destroy the world. But again, it starts with the idea of the blurring of reality and the dream, right? The blurring of sleep and wakefulness. And that blurring is, I think, what's key to that earlier part of the myth becoming reality, is that kind of things aren't very clear, and so the result can be violent. Okay, I have to introduce this concept, and I know that we probably won't get very far in the part 3 collapsology. I will just point you to some sources. But what he was doing, what Crimo was doing, was something called schizoposting. Schizoposting is a world of the internet in which people basically try to create such confusing content that it's supposed to induce a kind of mental illness in the watcher. You're supposed to watch this and then become detached from reality. Through graphic violence, it's a derealization, right? You detach, you dissociate from reality. Okay, I'll just say this. These communities lose track of what is real and what is fake. This is one of the analysts of schizoposting. So it's a collective dissociation, a collective detachment, a collective derealization. And it's meant to be spread. Okay, I'm going to move quickly. So Emmy Conley, also an analyst, says, I'll just read this. Reality isn't real for these schizoposters, for people like Cremo. They want to test how real reality is, but test it with violence, test it with a gun, exposed to simulation. It's nihilism, depression, and extremely digital culture. Okay, it is also part of doomerism, and this is where I get to the part 3. Doomerism is both a meme and a kind of cultural figure online of the young person who has given up hope, right? And there's this is the doomer here, and some people are worried, right? Rebecca Solnit, for instance, says we can't afford to be climate doomers. And this is where I wanted to kind of get to the end, that yes, when it's tied to this kind of relationship to death and to the end of the world, yes, we don't want this kind of schizoposting. This is the conclusion to that part. If this contemporary fascist imagination wants to create this life-destroying reality with the latest technology, right, it's doing this to specifically control how the world ends. It wants to control how the end of the world happens, a kind of doomerist phantasmagoria embodied in this, in the figure of the doomer, but really Cremo, that particular shooter. But here's where I wanted to end, is that not everything is so bleak, not everything is that version of doomer, that there is a way to think about collapse and imagination that doesn't have the same nihilism, paralysis, passivity, or violence as action. And this is graffiti from, but I'm thinking of 2 books here that I've been reading recently. One is called Breaking Together, and one is called Another End of the World is Possible. And it is trying to work towards this idea of what it would mean to accept an irreversible decline and collapse, but without the same kind of doom, the same kind of passivity. This to me is what imagining in the interregnum might look like. It's the first step, they say, is to realize just how bad it is. And begin to think about and to imagine what life might be like in the next few years. Let me see which I should jump through here. I would just say check out the books. Maybe I'll say this, because the difference between doomerism and what they call doomsterism. Doomerism is what I already showed you, right? The doomer generation, the passivity, maybe the violence, giving up. Doomsterism, what they say is like, well, we have to give up a certain kind of hope that says, oh, we'll fix things, progress, the technological solutions, that those are grasping at things that prop up a system that will only decline anyway. So doomsterism does not have that paralysis, passivity, indifference. No, it's what they also call collapsosophy. It's a very strange word. What is the wisdom? What is that comes out of this moment? A certain imagination has left us. Where are we left? And how can we begin to witness that space and begin to imagine from there to slow down? We can always slow down the collapse, and also find and build a world of both life and beauty during that collapse too. Here's one example, the Dark Mountain Project, which is a collection of artists, thinkers, writers that have been around, I think, for 10 years or so, and they are gathering people who can imagine in this way, sustainable autonomous zones, Black joy. I mentioned this in my abstract, so I have to just at least mention it. What does it mean to still have, despite all the I was just in Bologna, and they have this this exhibition, which is really good, about the history, contemporary part of which is, okay, last slide then. What can emerge from such a landscape? What is the imagination that can emerge from a time of collapse? And I wish I could have had more time to talk about it, but perhaps it's other worlds, but different kind of other worlds. And this is a little book, The Other Worlds Review, which is about a kind of anarchist-based occult and spiritual life. They also called it Other Worlds. So, okay, thank you. And if we have time for questions now, I can take one, but I don't know how much time we have.
Grazie per queste fantasmagorie e anche per l'analisi molto interessante insomma, di questo linguaggio necrofilo della destra americana che riguarda anche le destre europee. C'è qualcuno che vuole fare una domanda?
Ok, estremamente interessante. Anche chi cerca di stare al passo con tutte le questioni perde dei pezzi, e lei ha dato tutti i pezzi. Non ha mai usato la parola apocalittica, che pure sarebbe molto appropriata per descrivere questo clima, ma forse la ragione c'è, è che manca un altro termine diciamo, a monte di tutta questa analisi, e cioè che noi cerchiamo un senso di quello che sta succedendo, e per avere un senso di quello che sta succedendo dobbiamo fare appello alla ragione, e qui è la parola che manca. Cioè, forse in una situazione caotica come quella che percepiamo, forse dovremmo tentare di ridefinire e di ritornare, di riappropriarci del logos classico che sta alla base della nostra civiltà occidentale. Se rinunciamo a questo, i risultati sono questa implosione in una direzione che è tutto tranne che la realtà.
Grazie, thank you for the excellent question. I will focus just on the two words, the two main concepts, apocalypse and reason or logos. Yeah, I didn't talk about apocalypse because it is so loaded. It's such a loaded word, and I think because it's also an ambivalent, well, not ambivalent one. It's open to at least two interpretations, right? Apocalypse as a sort of end of the world, which is often the way, at least the religious configuration in the U.S., the Western religious notion of apocalypse, as that kind of Armageddon version of it. But the other one, which I think is actually closer to something that I would incorporate apocalypse, is its meaning when it means a grand revelation, a great awakening, a great moment of understanding. So that what it's the end of is the end of a certain set of illusions and a certain way of being that can no longer be sustainable. So the collapsologists I mentioned, they talk about apocalypse, but they use that second, an older term, older meaning, which is to become aware, and it's a collective upheaval in understanding. Not that it's the end of the world, but it is the world, but it's the end of a world. Reason and logos is also tricky because some would argue, and I would agree, that some part of that reason and logos led to the very systems that are destroying the earth in such a way that we have inherited it, right? The way that that version of reason, of Western Enlightenment, took nature, took the feminine and subordinated it to this idea of reason and logos. It might not be the only way to think about reason and logos, but we can't keep the old one because that also led to the misery that is today. Now, at the same time, again, I'll point to these books that they say, yes, there is a place for reason. And part of that is the recognition, a kind of realism about how we got to where we are today, what the crisis really is, and it requires a kind of empirically based knowledge and understanding. So that part of reason, empirical based knowledge, yes. Can we do without the imagination in that moment? Can we do without the collective meaning and even perhaps myth? That's hard to say because that is such a part of what we are as humans too, to tell stories, right? Stories aren't always reasonable, but reason is important to understand the conditions under which we can imagine and tell stories. So I think both of those terms are very important. I didn't talk about them, but they're crucial, and they're both very complicated about how we got here. So grazie, thank you.
Allora dobbiamo concludere e ci troviamo tra poco con l'ultimo dei nostri appuntamenti con Albena Zmanova alle ore 12. Grazie.